thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Walcott. And I would like to ask for a little background about magnetoreception in general. That's not a familiar term, I think, in general, but people do know that creatures migrate. So what is magnetoreception, please? And what's the source of the field?
The source of the field is really the Earth's magnetic field. The Earth is rather like a grapefruit through which you've stuffed a bar magnet. And so there is a North Pole and a South Pole, and there is a strong field at the North and the South Pole, and a rather weaker field in the middle. It's like picking up paper clips with a bar magnet. You stick to the end of the magnet, not so much to the middle. And the Earth has this magnetic field, and there are a variety of animals that are able to detect it and use it for a number of different purposes, but generally for finding their way around.
I see. So these creatures, especially we always think of migratory birds, but there are, I think, fish, insects, butterflies, all sorts of creatures that can use this, and they can travel enormous distances and not get lost. We humans get lost just going around the block, but in any case, this is a very enviable thing. Now, is this only north-south? Does that magnetic field only go north-south?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
However, whoever inserted the magnet in the middle of the Earth didn't get it quite straight. And so there is a difference between geographic north, the North Pole that we think of, and the North Pole of the magnetic field of the Earth, which is some distance away and moving, I would say, slowly towards Russia. It changes every year. Yeah. And that difference varies as you move east and west. And whether any animal is able to take advantage of that is still somewhat controversial.
Okay. Now, about the animals, the creatures that can use this, can you give us some examples of these migrating creatures?
Well, the first example I would give is what are called magnetotactic bacteria. And these are little bacteria that live on the surface of the mud. And occasionally they get stirred up when there are waves and so on, and they have to find their way back to the mud. And it turns out that they have in them little particles of magnetite, which is an iron compound, which is highly magnetic. And so these little bacteria line up with the Earth's magnetic field. They wiggle their flagellae and they find their happy home back on the surface of the mud. And that's a system we really understand quite well. But the more dramatic ones, like the Arctic terns that nest off the coast of Maine and up into Canada, and then fly down to Antarctica for the winter, we know much less about, except that we suspect that they too use the Earth's magnetic field as some sort of a clue in their migration.
I see. Are there fish and things like butterflies and other creatures that use this as well?
Yes, there certainly are. I think there's evidence that the monarch butterflies are able to use the Earth's magnetic field. There certainly is some evidence that salmon are able to do it. You asked in one of your questions, was migration always north and south? And the answer is no. It can be east and west. Think of the Pacific salmon and the Atlantic salmon that go out into the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean and have to find their way back a year or two later to the same gravel bed where they themselves were hatched. And so that migration is certainly east and west.
Yes, that's so, and there are a number of different creatures that can use it. Fish, reptiles like turtles, those sea turtles and so on, apparently, and butterflies like the monarch butterflies and so on. And it's really quite amazing. Also, it's true that they go back to very precise areas. Is that correct? Very often some of these migrants go back to their nesting grounds every year. They don't, it's not random.
No, it certainly is not random.
Okay.
The salmon return, as I say, to the gravel beds where they were hatched. And the birds, it turns out, for the most part, have winter places and summer places, like a kind of human approach. So it isn't just going north in the spring and south in the fall. It's going to a particular place in New Hampshire and a particular place down in South America. And obviously they move around a certain amount in these places, but it's a very specific location both times.
It is certainly enviable that they have that capability. The rest of us,
Indeed.
we have to use maps and all sorts of Google and everything else. Now, Dr. Walcott, I think you have worked on creatures that are, we wouldn't say migratory in the same sense, like the homing pigeon. And that, I think, is supposed to be some of the best work that confirmed this magnetoreception. Not sure, but can you tell us about that?
Yes, the problem with working with migratory birds is that you have a very short season where you can work on it in the fall and the spring, basically when they're migrating. And they're inconvenient in another sense in that they travel such big distances. The nice thing about a homing pigeon is it lives in a loft and you can take it after doing a certain amount of training, any direction from the loft up to 1,000 miles away, let it go, and it flies home. And the question is, of course, how do they do that? And there are two problems that the pigeon faces. The first, when it's released, is where am I with relation to home? And that we call the map. And the second is, once you've figured out that you need to fly south in order to go home, they need a compass, and they use the sun when it's available. But here in Ithaca, New York, where it's almost always overcast and the sun is not available, they switch and use the Earth's magnetic field. And we are convinced of this. First off, Bill Keaton put little magnets on the pigeon's head and found that at some release points, under some circumstances, these birds were disoriented. We put a pair of coils around the pigeon's head, one on the top of its head and one around its neck. And the nice thing about that is that we were able to use the same coils with the same current. The only thing we varied was the polarity of the magnetic field. You turn the battery around and reverse the flow of current, you now reverse the flow of the magnetic field. And so we had two kinds, pigeons with north ups and pigeons with south up, nups and sups, we call them. And what we found was that under sunny skies, everybody flew straight home, not a problem. But under overcast, sups flew straight home, nups flew 180 degrees away from home. I got into deep trouble talking about this because people said, well, how could you do such a brutal thing to that pigeon? It didn't get home, its wife and children. I mean, it's so sad. And I forgot to mention that the batteries last only about an hour. And then the magnetic field dies and the pigeon turns around and flies home, bringing everything, the apparatus and batteries and so on, all home with it so we can take them off.
That is really interesting because I guess that really helped to clarify the field, or I should say, the sensory apparatus that the pigeon had to use the field. Is that correct?
It seems so. But then the second thing was even more surprising. There are places on the surface of the Earth where the magnetic field is all disturbed because of big deposits of iron or something.
Oh, yeah.
And if you take homing pigeons from our loft in Lincoln, Massachusetts, to those particular places, they are disoriented. And it turns out that the stronger the magnetic anomaly, the greater the disorientation of the pigeon. And this is under sunny skies. So they're using the sun as a compass, not the magnetic field. And then we tried pigeons from here in Ithaca, and they simply ignored magnetic anomalies and flew straight home. And so finally, we did an experiment where we had two lofts in Lincoln, Massachusetts. One, our old loft at Fox Ridge Farm, and the second at Codman Community Farm, about a mile distant. And it turns out pigeons raised at Fox Ridge Farm were totally disoriented at magnetic anomalies. Their sisters and brothers raised at Codman Farm flew straight home. They didn't pay any attention to magnetic anomalies. And so we wondered what was going on. And finally, we looked at the magnetic field where the pigeons were growing up. And we found that at Fox Ridge Farm, they were growing up on a steep magnetic slope, 450 nanoteslers per kilometer. Whereas at Community Farm, a mile or two away, it was magnetic flatland. There was essentially no magnetic gradient. It's only about, I don't remember, 40 or 50 nanoteslers per kilometer. So that maybe the birds at Fox Ridge Farm, our original loft, learned that the magnetic field was useful in finding your location, whereas the birds at Codman Farm learned that some other cue, perhaps odor, was important.
Isn't that interesting? And that's the next question, actually. Are there other forms of sensory, other sensory apparatus that are these animals use?
Oh, yes, by all means.
So you mentioned
pigeons
smell.
are extraordinary. They're able to hear very, very low frequency sounds. They're able to see in the ultraviolet. They are very, very sensitive to changes in air pressure. They can detect, for example, the difference between the floor and the ceiling in the room in which I am, which is about 8 feet. And they are also able to detect odors. So they have a whole sensory capability, and exactly how this all works is still somewhat mysterious and hotly debated.
On the debates themselves, what are the issues? Can you give us a little idea there? I know there are like 3 theories, and that there's still lots of controversy. And in fact, apparently it took a long time for acceptance of magnetoreception, that a lot of people denied it. So what are these other aspects?
Well, a group in Italy, led originally by Floriano Papi, believed that the pigeons were using odors to find their way home. A pigeon growing up in a loft learned that the wind from the north smelled like the olives, or the wind from the south is the fields of garlic or whatever. So that by paying attention to the wind direction and to the odors it brings, then when they're released somewhere, they sniff the breeze and say, aha, that's what came on a north wind, and I fly south in order to go home. Or alternatively, as the pigeons are taken out to the release point, they pay attention to the odors that they experience on the way out, and then they simply reverse the odors on the way back. And there's quite a lot of evidence that supports that basic idea, but it still, I think, is highly controversial. A second theory is that they are using very low frequency sounds. The world is very noisy at sounds way below the frequencies we can hear. Our hearing stops at about 20 cycles per second. A pigeon can hear down to 2/100ths of a cycle per second, uh, extraordinarily low frequencies. And there's a lot of noise down there. And the theory is that pigeons are paying attention to sound in order to find their way home. And those are the three kind of theories at the moment.
Right. Does that apply to the migratory birds that are traveling thousands of miles as well? The same issue, they might be using senses like the sound or smell.
I don't think anybody knows.
Uh-huh.
I
And
think
we
there's
can't ask them.
evidence,
Yeah.
a lot of evidence for their use of the Earth's magnetic field as a compass. There's some evidence for the use of the Earth's magnetic field as a map, that is to find out where you are with relation to where you want to go. But it's clear that different birds are doing different things.
Ah,
And I think the big message I would have for everybody is one size doesn't fit all.
I see.
I mean, if you grew up in New York City, you'd pay attention to the streets because they're
Mhm.
thoughtfully aligned. Whereas in Boston, where it was laid out by cows, it's not quite so easy.
Right. And with that disparaging remark about Boston. Now, one other thing is that in terms of these long migrations, the child birds and butterflies and so on, that's their first time out. Do they get lost fast? And is that a thing?
Well, the most dramatic experiment was done with white-crowned sparrows, which they captured in California and released in Princeton, New Jersey. And what happened was the adults basically headed back to their wintering grounds in California, whereas the juveniles of the year headed south in the direction that they would normally fly were they in California. And so the suggestion is that for birds anyway, that the young are using a compass mechanism and have not mostly developed the ability to navigate, to absolutely find their home location. For monarch butterflies, obviously, every time it's the first time because they migrate down to Mexico, they spend the winter there, and then they move north and lay eggs and die. And it's the next generation that moves up. So it's always a new generation that's migrating down to the wintering ground in Mexico.
Right, I see. So, but so far it's complicated and there's a lot that is unknown, right? Right. So we
Yes,
got that
I think we
part.
can
Okay.
all agree that it's
This is real
complicated.
science, all these questions. Well, another thing is that do you have, you do all this you have done all this neurobiology research and so on. Do you look for areas of the brain in, say, birds or whatever, in terms of developing the sensory features?
No, I have not done
Okay.
that. That's
Okay.
not
I
something
didn't know
I
if
have looked
anybody
at.
did, but
Others have, and it's clear that the hippocampus is very much involved
memory.
in this kind of thing. But exactly how it works, even
Right.
what are the sense organs involved, I
Yeah.
think it's pretty well agreed that the eyes and the retina are involved in the magnetic compass in some way. But what the magnetic map may be associated with is probably different.
Right.
And might well be associated with magnetite somewhere else in the animal's head.
Right.
But we really don't know. It's still very much an open question.
That's quite interesting. And then you mentioned, though, that the eye is important, but a lot of these birds, do they not fly at night, for example? Then they switch off to some other sensory mechanism, or their eyes?
We know that, for example, many night migrating birds use a celestial compass that is based on stars within 30 degrees or so of the North Star. And they use that as a compass.
Right, I see. So they have a variety then of possibilities, of features, of physical apparatus that can be deployed in different situations. It's a little bit flexible, it sounds like,
Mhm.
and then there is still a great deal that's just not known. And from creature to creature, it's still more unknown, apparently. And you can't interview the birds and the fish and so on. It's not working. But I expect technology will be able to get in there and take care of that one of these days. I wonder that if you would please tell us about some of the other really interesting things you have worked on. I have a special request, the spiders, because everybody needs to know how they hear.
They walk on their ears and they hear with their
Exactly.
legs.
8 years, 8 years.
And
Right.
it turns out that the little spiders that I work with, which are the ones that you find in the corner of windows that make little messy, irregular webs. I'm sure not in your house, but, these spiders are very sensitive to airborne sound. And we know that because we have recorded from the nerves in their legs. And so we can tell what they are able to listen to. It turns out that it has been recently shown that orb web spiders, like Charlotte, that builds the big orb web, is using the whole web as kind of an ear to pick up vibrations and so on. And that's quite surprising and interesting. The problem that my little spiders that make the messy webs face is that they have to detect an insect hitting the web, and they may not be standing on the right web strand so that they don't get the information through the silk, they get it through the air. And that's why they are so extraordinarily sensitive. Whereas the Charlottes of this world in the big orb web are on the web, and so they're able to detect it through the silk itself.
And that seems like it may have something to do with the actual structure of that web too, because a vibration on one strand might that is, it would signal the whole web, where perhaps that just because of the design of the web, maybe so the Charlotte's web will work out a little better than the messy web.
Yes, indeed, exactly.
I would like to point out too that although you have retired, you're still messing with these spiders. Is that correct?
That is correct. I still am making life difficult for spiders.
Okay, but it's very interesting. The other neat thing that we hear about is your work with the loons, and this is communication that is quite sophisticated, apparently. Can you tell us a wee bit about that?
Yes, the male loon has a vocalization called a yodel. And what it essentially, yodel, right. And what it essentially says is, if you are another male loon and you come here, I will try and dive underneath you and spear you with my beak. And that's a rough translation. And what is interesting is that each individual loon has its own individual yodel. And it is stable from year to year as long as the loon occupies the same territory, the same lake. When the male changes to a new territory, to a new lake, it changes its yodel to be different than that of its predecessor and of the other loons in the neighborhood. For some reason, it's very important that the loon be different. And if it, for example, then moves back to its original territory, it goes back to its original vocalization. And what's interesting about it, of course, is why do they do this? Of course, be one interesting question. But a second is it's surprising because people had the feeling that loons were very primitive birds and that they would have just one vocalization, which was stable and not changeable. And yet now we begin to learn that it is in fact changeable, and it's changeable in important and curious ways. But why, we still really don't know.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sound. It's only up there in the north. Do you have them in New York? Do you have loons in New York? I always
Oh,
think of
yes,
Maine.
indeed, we do. We have
Oh,
them right here in Cayuga Lake as
I
they
see.
stop off on the way to the breeding ground.
Right. And they start squawking, yodeling at other males and stuff. Now, this is strictly a male thing, the vocalization. The women don't talk. Is that
Oh, the
the idea?
women talk, but they don't yodel.
They don't yodel.
They do all sorts of other things. Everybody does uh, two other kinds of vocalizations, and it's just that only the male gives this yodel.
And is that something new to follow this in the loons that people had not looked into this before?
Well,
This
they had, but the
very
problem
specific.
was that their loons were not banded, and so one loon tends to look very much like another loon.
Oh, yeah, I see.
And
Yep.
excuse me, and we were very fortunate to work with Walter Piper out in Wisconsin, where he had a big population of banded loons, so we knew who was related to who,
Mhm.
and were able to track individuals and relate then the individual loon to the individual vocalization for a substantial population of loons.
Yeah, that's very fun work, I'm sure, as well. So you communicate real well with these creatures, all sorts of creatures. You've studied so many things. You've really taken up a lot of different things in your long career. Do you have any real favorites?
I don't know. I just enjoy the natural world and kind of exploring how these various animals are adapted to living in their environment. And I'm particularly interested in what kind of sense organs they have
Yeah.
and how they use these various cues, whether it be the broadcast of the loons or the vibration for the spiders, or how these pigeons manage to find their way home without apparently using a GPS.
Right, right. And how could that happen? I keep thinking of that too. But one of the interesting things is that you've looked into the sensory capacities here, that the acute hearing, the acute smell, their senses seem to be, and vision, really amplified among different creatures. Have you gone into that a good bit?
Well, sure. I mean, the different creatures live in different ways. And I think humans have the mistaken impression sometimes that animals have the same sensory capabilities that we do. And the answer is no, they don't. They live in different environments, they have different problems to solve, and they therefore have very different sensory capabilities. And that's what's kind of fascinating to look at these things.
Right. Dr. Walcott, we're running out of time now, but this is so interesting. And I think you have kept on researching, although you have retired. You're going to keep this up?
I hope
I
so.
think so. And I really appreciate your giving us this terrific information, and a great deal of it today. And thank you ever so much for joining us, and take care.
Be a pleasure. Thank you.